I want to bring in Gillian Turner. Gillian, were you listening? Did you see and hear that comment from Secretary Kerry about comparing the Friday the 13th attacks last week in Paris to the Charlie Hebdo attack? He used the word legitimate or legitimacy, and I just wanted your reaction. This seems in some way as an administration that thinks that these are individuals, terrorists who can somehow be changed, even talked to, even rationalized with.
Yeah, and I think something that was really reflected in President Obama's remarks from Antalya was that he doesn't necessarily see Friday the 13th attacks as a game changer, which they so clearly were for most of the world, not just the Western world, but across the Middle East and Asia as well. I think that even then he continued to sort of tout these tactical successes that the anti-ISIS coalition had had. So he was talking about an ISIS supply route that was disrupted in Syria. He was talking about a cell that had been disrupted in Iraq. But the failure there is to really appreciate just how much of a game changer these events were and are going to continue to be, and that in a certain sense, the minute that these terrorists infiltrated the French homeland and executed these attacks in the heart of the capital, it really obliterated, to most people, most Americans certainly, it obliterated whatever sort of small-scale successes we've had overseas in the Middle East. The force of the fight is now in Europe. It's in the heart of Western Europe. ISIS has declared war there and are carrying it out on the streets of the French capital.
Ian, I want to get your reaction because she did touch on something, because you did say earlier that the U.S. right now is still a fairly marginal actor in all this. You were referencing the bombing, the coordination between France and Russia. I want to know, do you think that our role changes or does not change at this point?
Well, I want to be clear that it's not as if the French government is itching to put boots on the ground in Syria either. As much as this is a game changer for France, most of that is about fighting this war within their country. The biggest problem for France is not about Syrian refugees, and we need to be really careful about conflating refugees with terrorists, something that's very politically cheap to do, and many candidates are doing it, and many in Europe are doing it for political gain, but of course it's not a reality. In France, 8% of the population is Muslim. They're mostly citizens. Their vast majority are not refugees. They're very disenfranchised, and a lot of them have been easy targets for extremist Islam. This is a huge problem for France that they've not been addressing appropriately for decades, and it's becoming much larger. Now, there's no question that you're right, that Obama does not want to see these attacks as a game changer for U.S. policy, because the challenges of what the Americans do or don't do on the ground in Syria have not changed from before the French attacks to after. The fact that the Americans have had a hard time finding people that they would consider trustworthy in going after ISIS itself, that the Americans would be able to effectively arm and train. That was challenging a year ago, 6 months ago. It's challenging today. The other thing I would say, which is new, is the fact that ISIS itself has become more strategic in its attacks, more capable, and the fact that we've seen ISIS directly say that there are now, that Washington is in the bullseye. They've said Washington is next. I got to tell you that if you're the Obama administration right now and you know that Syria is an incredibly slippery slope and it's getting steeper, and you know that you're probably going to be under massive political pressure to quote-unquote do more, you really would, and you know that doing more is going to be very unpalatable and probably unsustainable in terms of political support from American citizens over the medium to long term. You want to wait on that, especially if you think that you might have to respond to an attack in the United States. So I think that there's lots of appropriate reasons why the Obama administration doesn't want to jump in. And, here you talk about Donald Trump, who, much as not a guy I'd want to quote on foreign policy, but the fact that he would say, hey, let the Russians do the fighting and blow these guys up and they can all kill each other. I recognize that the Russians haven't thus far been primarily attacking ISIS. They're going after mostly the enemies of Assad, who have not been ISIS. but they're doing more against ISIS now. And I happen to think that position that the Americans really would rather see other people pursue this fight and not take it themselves is actually a quite popular one. And it's one that Obama has to be wrestling with right now.
Just really, Ian, I want to get Arthur is shaking his head, yes. But
Ian,
I'm going to say this, but until something happens here at home, then everything changes, potentially.
Absolutely. And then, we know that as those of us who are New Yorkers, we know it firsthand, and that's why we really feel for the people of Paris. But, Ian, I think people agree. I think even people who don't agree with Donald Trump often say, you know what, before we blow off another American kid's legs or arms, if the Russians are willing to take the fight to them, and that airplane being blown up, I mean, Ian, you're right on target where the Russians changed their targets, and hopefully, look, if they could get involved. I had someone tell me last night, President Obama's biggest coup would be somehow or another to get China involved. If we get the Chinese involved, the Chinese, the Russians, and the Americans all focus on the same target, we're pretty powerful.
We're expecting